Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? A little louder? You're going to turn it up a little bit. Maybe. We're going to test it. Is it any louder?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. That's too much. All right. That's much better. Good. Okay. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Happy Easter, everyone. Christ is risen. Alleluia. Alleluia. Today is the day that makes us Christians. It is the day that our entire belief system rests on. Today, Jesus becomes the Christ, the risen one. This is the good news of the gospel, the best news, you might say, the greatest news of our religion of Christianity. Therefore, you might be expecting a profound message from me as your pastor today. You might have expectations that you are going to hear the best sermon of the year. But here's the thing. I could preach the best sermon ever, and it still wouldn't compare to the whole purpose of this day. Now don't worry, I'm still going to preach. But I don't want us to get confused. You are not here to focus on me and what I have to say. We are here to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus and the good news that is found in that message. As pastor, I am here to point us to God and the good news of Jesus. I am not God nor Jesus. I'm a regular human just like the rest of you, looking for hope in the promise of the holy resurrection. The Easter message is the same every year. We just need to be reminded of it and hear it in new ways with new ears. We need to be transformed to open our hearts to not only hear the message of Jesus' holy resurrection, but also act on the great news that it promises us as a Christian church. We are all here to celebrate the promise of new life that we receive through Jesus, and it's my job to remind us of this glorious news and point us to give thanks to God for new life. Alleluia! Alleluia! Today we heard the gospel reading from Matthew, and I'm not going to compare all the ways that this account of the resurrection is slightly different from the other gospels. But as you heard it, you might have noticed that there are some differences from the others. One major way it is different is that the women coming to see the tomb aren't bringing their spices to anoint Jesus. They are just coming to see the tomb. Many scholars note that this distinction may have meant that they weren't expecting to see Jesus' body, but rather see Jesus alive. Jesus did, of course, tell the disciples over and over and over again about the whole resurrection story before it actually happened. So here, the women very well could have been coming to find Jesus trusting in what he had told them. The women believed him and were acting as dedicated disciples, trusting in his word. I related to the response of the women another difference in this account of the resurrection compared to the other Gospels. The women, after hearing the message of the angels, leave the tomb with fear and great joy, as our translation says, or fear and excitement in other translations. They weren't terrified like the guards who became like dead men, as the Gospel says, so afraid that they couldn't move or take in action. Rather, the women were energized by this glorious news and used their emotions to follow the directions of the angel. In hearing the description of the women's feelings, fear and excitement, I couldn't help but think of times in my life when I have had similar feelings. In high school, just before I stepped onto the mat to wrestle or onto the block to swim, I always felt this great urge to use the bathroom. Believe it or not, I did debate whether or not to share that uneasy. But here we are. It was my body's response to nervous energy, as some might call it. That feeling of knowing this is a big, important moment and I don't want to mess it up. That feeling of being both scared and excited at the same time. Skited, as one of my favorites, author and activist Glennon Doyle calls it. Maybe you've heard of this kind of emotion, or maybe you felt it yourself just before a big event in your life, like getting married or starting a new job or having a baby or moving to a new town. Maybe you feel this way with smaller things too, like right before a test or a job review or giving a big speech. I wonder if the women felt sighted because they were being asked to speak the hard truth. They were entrusted with spreading the message of Jesus' holy resurrection with the disciples, becoming the very first apostles. They didn't know how this message would be received. They had no idea that hundreds of years later we would still be celebrating and proclaiming this news today. They were tasked with something that was exciting because of the amazing news that it was, but it was also nerve-wracking because it was a big deal. This resurrection news was a huge promise being fulfilled, and they were tasked with sharing it with others who may or may not have believed them. Come back next week if you're not in belief. We'll talk about that more. Still today, justice makers like you and me are tasked with proclaiming hard truths. Truths such as all people, transgender and cisgender folks alike, are created in the image of God. Or truth that human lives matter more than our guns. Or the truth that climate change is real and caring for the earth needs to be a priority. Or the truth that Black lives matter. Or the truth that women deserve bodily autonomy. As Easter people, believing in the promise of new life given to us through Jesus, the risen Christ, we are tasked with spreading the never-ending love of God around to all those that we meet. This includes speaking hard truths and continuing to stand up for justice, just like Jesus did. One of the stories that we don't hear in the several worship opportunities that we have during Holy Week, even though it happens during the Holy Week story, is of Jesus flipping the tables in the temple. Even in his last days, Jesus stood up to the power and principalities of the day, which, to bring us back to Good Friday, is the reason he was crucified. The leaders of the day were so fearful of how his beliefs would tear apart the systems that continue to oppress the lowly and outcasts that they tried to stop him. But as we know, in being here today to celebrate Jesus' holy resurrection, death does not have the last word. Silencing people for speaking up against powers who are causing harm to the whole of God's creation will not have the last word. Just like Jesus meets the women as they are on their way to tell the disciples the news, Jesus meets us here today and says, do not be afraid. We might be scared and excited, but we do not need to be so afraid that we are terrified into inaction like the guards. We are tasked with a very important role as Christians to follow the risen Christ as believers of the promise of life after death. we are tasked to carry on the message of love, justice, hope, and new life that Jesus stood for. And by doing so, we become part of the holy resurrection that we celebrate today. Alleluia.